All right, welcome and greetings, everyone. My name is Lisa Knight. I'm the editor and co-director of Shuddhashar FreeVoice and a professor of anthropology and department chair at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Shuddhashar began in 1990 in Bangladesh. From 2004 until October 2015, it grew into a major publication house and a socio-political movement, supporting critical thinking, progressive values, and emerging writers and thinkers. In 2017, after forced exile, Shuddhashar restarted online as an online platform with very much the same type of mission, but now including also exiles and a wider readership. And to all of you in Bangladesh right now and across the diaspora, a very warm, happy Independence Day of Bangladesh. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Shuddhashar FreeVoice webinar on erotic art and fabulous defiance, reclaiming the body through art. This is an extension of our most recent magazine issue, issue 46, which was called Subversive Art and published in February of this year. Today's conversation brings together Tamar, Ballard, and Ibtisam, Ahmed in dialogue with our moderator, Afra Sampreety, to explore how subversive art reclaims the body, desire, and selfhood across Black feminist and queer contexts. Moving between Black women's music and the queer catwalk, we'll think about creative practices that don't ask for permission or validation, but instead center intimacy, embodiment, and bold forms of expression. Today and together, this conversation reflects on art as a site of resistance, pleasure, and radical possibility. I'm pleased to introduce our guests. Ibtisam Ahmed is a scholar and performer from Bangladesh living in the UK. His work engages in utopianism, queer theory, and decolonial practice with a focus on radical community growth. He recently completed a BA Level funded project, his House of Spice Collective, which is definitely worth watching and seeing and learning more about. His article for this issue 46 is called Fabulous Fabulations, Brown Empowerment on the Queer Catwalk. And you can see where we got some of our title for this particular webinar. Tamar Ballard is a doctoral candidate in sociology at Virginia Tech and an interdisciplinary scholar of Black American popular music. Her work explores how Black music making and listening practices both reflect and move beyond the reverberations of anti-Black systems of domination. Her article published in this issue is called Calling Out My Own Name, Black Women's Music, Sexual Agency, and Sounds of Pleasure. And our moderator, Afra Sampreety, is a Norwegian student based in the UK whose interest spans film, culture, and politics, with a focus on digital media, visual storytelling, and contemporary culture. Her article for this issue is called Anarchy in Madrid, Pepi Luci Bom as Political Manifesto. So I would say within all of these articles and issues, all these articles and the work that they've done, there are lots of tips into other things that you should explore, whether it's music and film or performance on stage. So check out the articles and also see where those things take you. And so you can read their articles on our website. For our webinar, we do have the question and answer function available. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and ask them as we're going along. We'll be looking at that and we will pull them forward toward the end of our conversation as time allows. So thank you, everyone. And I will now turn things over to Sampreety.
Thank you for that introduction and welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is Bangladesh's Independence Day. So I think it's very meaningful that we are having this discussion about bodies, autonomy, and liberation on a day which celebrates self-determination. So I want to hold that context with us as we move into this discussion. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think instead of having a formal panel, we can just kind of share like our ideas and explore the themes together and like think out loud, and how like talk about basically how sexuality, representation, and power intersect, especially in relationship to like marginalized bodies. I'll bring in some themes and questions along the way, but I would really encourage all of you guys to respond to each other, build on ideas, and even challenge each other where it's useful. And also share your questions. I know both of you had some interesting questions you wanted to ask. Um, to frame things a little, we're thinking about how marginalized bodies express themselves through art, through sexuality, through pleasure, and how that expression interacts with the way they're seen. There's often tension between autonomy and perception, between what someone intends and how it gets read through dominant frameworks. And at the same time, many of us are navigating systems, what like Western norms, patriarchy, and like there's different things which teaches us what's normal and what's acceptable. So it's difficult to explore your identity within these norms technically. So some of the questions that I'll be guiding today are: what does it mean to claim erotic agency right now? And how do we move forward towards like what's actually liberatory like in this context? And what happens when pleasure, embodiment, and expression become political? I think it would be really interesting if we just start off with what interested both of you to like write about this or to explore these themes and to like talk about this. Yeah. If anyone wants to go first, that
Tamar, did you want to go first? I'm happy to, but
I would love for you to go first.
Okay. So in terms of what drew me to writing, I should say Shuddhashar has been a platform I've followed immensely and I've actually written for before. So when I saw the call go out, it felt a bit like a no-brainer. But in terms of what I wanted to reflect on, a lot of it actually comes back to what you've mentioned in your framing, Sampreety, about like agency and perception. Because as someone who's queer, as someone who is brown within that space, and someone who's also a migrant within that space, because there's that added layer of nationality that comes in, I kind of always found it really frustrating that people politicized my existence, regardless of whether I wanted it politicized or not. I think a very almost like a cliche, you know, that a lot of queer folks, certainly in the UK, hears, oh, even if you hold hands in public, it's a radical political act. And it can be an empowering thing to hear, but it can also be quite exhausting to have kind of that imposed onto you. And certainly from a brown perspective and from a migrant perspective on top of that, there's the challenges of exoticization, fetishization. You know, if you look at any dating app in the global north and you look at kind of you add a racialized angle on top of that, for instance, that's just something that is just an everyday example of how our bodies get perceived regardless of what our individual experiences are. So the performance work that I do with the House of Spice Collective, which I helped co-found, is very much about owning our own selves and actually disturbing this notion of brownness and queerness being one easily digestible thing. And for me specifically, you know, the perspective I bring to the collective, because the collective has a lot of different brown queer perspectives, mine is very informed by my Bangladeshiness. It's very informed by my status as an immigrant, living in a Commonwealth country, or actually I say living in a Commonwealth country, living in kind of the heart of the Commonwealth. And, you know, it's very important that I always stress this in my work, that I come from a country where my queerness is criminalized, and I'm living in a country which criminalized that queerness in the first place. So a lot of what I try to bring onto the stage is that discomfort, but actually instead of putting that as a space where others can find catharsis at my expense, I kind of like to find the little bits of contradiction in that and where those tensions come from, and actually find my joy in that. And if that means that people who are viewing my work feel challenged or feel unsure of themselves, I actually think that's a bit of a good thing, because it's making them reconsider who's allowed to have comfort. It makes them reconsider what systems are like in terms of bringing subversion and bringing transgression onto bodies. So actually a lot of my work, we were talking about eroticization. A lot of my work isn't what you would call conventionally erotic, but I still think that by presenting myself as an unapologetically brown body, which often gets exoticized and eroticized, I'm kind of pushing back against what that means and claiming my agency and my autonomy in that. And I find it quite exciting. I find it quite fun, and I don't like clean answers. I kind of like bringing a bit of disruption into space.
Do you
So
think
that's
like
always fun.
when you as a performer, you disrupt the viewer's gaze, do you think it's political, like it's almost like a political stance you're making by disrupting the viewer's gaze through your art?
I think it is, and I think, but what I like about that is I'm the one bringing the politics into the conversation rather than having it imposed onto me. So it's very, I guess that intentionality to me matters, because there's a difference between someone taking my everyday life, like again, as I said, if I'm walking down the street holding my partner's hand and someone ascribes a politicization to that can feel quite dehumanizing. But if I'm bringing my work onto a space quite intentionally and leaving it out there, I think that ownership of what makes something politicizing, I think that's a huge difference between what's liberating versus quite kind of oppressive, I guess.
Yeah. So you're reclaiming your identity as a form of resistance almost, which works.
Yeah. And doing it on multiple fronts. Like I'm very, very one of the things I always keep saying to folks is a lot of times I'm the first queer Bangladeshi migrant they'll see on stage. And something I always keep telling folks is that please don't take me as like the queer Bangladeshi migrant experience. It's my experience. And I'm really happy to share that and what that means for me. But it's kind of very much as well about disrupting that notion that all communities are monolithic and they'll always have the same opinions, they'll always have the same culture. So it's also very much disrupting some of that as well, I think, is important.
And Tamar, what was your answer to what drew you to write about this?
So I'm glad that I let Ibtisam go first, because there's some things that you mentioned that made me feel like, okay, I need to say that in my answer too. But this paper, or my essay, came originally from a fuller paper that I wrote for a class maybe like 2 years ago. And I clearly hadn't let that paper go, but I was just kind of tucked it away and was like, I'm not going to do anything with it. But I am working on my dissertation project, and my dissertation is on concert lines and the ways that concert lines become these Black places, and they're not just kind of these in between nowhere kind of pass-throughs, but there is something happening there. And as I've been thinking about my dissertation and writing, one of the things that I've been thinking about that Ibtisam centered on is that idea of how easy it is to marginalize Black and brown bodies, and that our relationships with the image and looking just it's very there's a lot in it. Like there is so much in it that is agential, but there's also a lot of the ways that how we're marginalized is so vision bound. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about with my project is, okay, if Black bodies are going to be marginalized and that marginalization is based on vision, what are other ways of existing that kind of escape that? And something that I've been thinking about is sound. And so when I'm doing my dissertation project, I'm doing it as a sonic ethnography, where I'm going in and recording the line and then listening back for Black placemaking through that sound. And so for this essay, I'm doing something similar where I'm like, okay, well, if there's this vision piece and we're centering on, and the vision is the problem, and not always the problem, but the vision can be the problem, then what if we looked at the sound instead?
Yeah.
And what if we connected that to the ways that folks are hearing music and the way that the body responds to those sounds instead, and allowing that to be at the center versus the way that somebody is being seen. Ibtisam mentioned like fetishizing and like that idea of being easily digestible. Like those are things that kind of come up for me too. And I think that it's harder to easily digest the sound when that sound is
Yeah.
so deep rooted in your body versus kind of like having a brief kind of flash of the way that somebody looks and
Yeah.
having to kind of base their entire your entire view of that person on what you see.
Yeah. I'm also curious, this is a question to both of you, because both of you like mentioned the viewer, the audience, or in your case, the one who's listening. So do you think like the like what role does the audience play when it comes to digesting your art, when you're trying to reclaim your autonomy through your art? Like what role do they play, and can they be invited into these spaces of marginalized expression?
So it's interesting because the work that I talk about in my piece is specifically about the visual aesthetics of the queer catwalk. So for folks who may not be aware of it, what I'm specifically referring to is in a lot of queer nightlife spaces, competitive spaces, cultural spaces, there are often these events where performers like myself would pull together a costume and kind of walk the runway. So it's kind of a deconstruction of, the very exclusive high fashion catwalk and kind of bringing it to a more DIY queer perspective. And what's interesting for me is the very different bodily experiences, because for me, it's not for the person walking, it's not a visual experience. I'm not seeing myself as I walk down the runway. It's actually a very tactile experience for me, because a lot of the things that I certainly do with my costuming is I'm very intentional about the fabrics I use. I try to use Bangladeshi fabrics or fabrics that have kind of a heritage feel to them. I often recycle fabrics as much as I can. I also tend to walk barefoot on the runway, which is again a very a South Asian cultural practice. So for me, the experience is actually very, very tactile. It's always about the weight of the fabric, the movement of the fabric. Whereas for the audience, it is a very visual experience. They are literally watching my movement, and they're watching the clothing that I'm displaying in a certain way. So even though I'm inviting them in, and I say I am, these events are inviting folks in, the experience is never going to be the same for the viewer versus in the performer, because we are inherently engaging with different sensory perceptions and different kind of bodily ownership. And I actually think that's quite interesting as well, because there's like a level of almost safety around the extent to which we're inviting people in. So there's always like, we're bringing you in, but we're bringing you in on our terms. You get to see, you get to look, but not touch. And that's quite exciting as well, because again, for queer folks, the idea of being able to say you are not allowed to touch me is quite empowering as well sometimes.
Yeah. Do you think like the same applies to your case, Tamar, especially when you're working, Tamar, sorry, the way like sound works, and you want people to connect through the sound and not, there's like nothing visual in front, right?
I think that
at the same time, it's like, I know I asked the question, but like I also don't know if the answer should be always yes, that the viewer has to be included. That's also
right.
It could also be an answer like they actually don't have to be included.
Yeah, and that's
reclaim that.
That's kind of where I am, where I think that there is something to be said about there being a viewer. But even just kind of the extent of what the viewer is doing, you don't have control over that thing. I was going to show a book, but I'm using it to prop up my laptop, so I can't show it. But there's a book called After the Party by Joshua Chambers Letson. And it's a book about queer life and the way that parties kind of exist as this embodiment, the somatic experience of queerness.
Yeah.
And in it, there's a quote that I'm gonna butcher it because I can't get the book because it's under my laptop, but he says something like art isn't transformative on its own, but it can transform the consciousness of the viewer. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that there is something to be said about you making art for yourself, and that can be transformative in itself. But I
Yeah.
think that like the idea of the consciousness of the viewer being transformed requires a viewer to want to be transformed in the first place. Like you can't
Yeah.
Yeah.
transform someone that isn't interested in being transformed. You can't be in control of their gaze if they're committed to seeing queer bodies, black bodies, brown
Yeah.
bodies in a specific way. Just because they're seeing them in a space that's crafted for something
Mm.
doesn't mean that that's gonna transform their view from one of this body is for entertainment and this is a body that I should lust after or have pleasure
Mm.
around, and this is a body that's transforming their life but also my life based on kind of
Yeah.
how they're creating their world. So I think it's dependent, but I don't think I don't think that just because there is that push and pull that means that the queer black brown bodies need to be concerned about that at all. I think that
Mm.
that is the viewer's own experience. I don't think that we need to like take that on and be like, okay, well, how do I make my art digestible enough for someone to have
Yeah.
this transformative experience? It's just do you get it or do you don't? And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think that it's up for an artist to have
It's
to
mhm.
make that space. You either
Mm.
you got it or you don't.
And I
Yeah.
think as well, just to hop onto that as well, it's also about thinking quite strategically as artists, right? Like sometimes I've performed in a range of kind of these catwalk events where some are very intentionally quite transformative because of the folks that they reach out to. Oftentimes it's other queer folks themselves kind of coming to celebrate. But sometimes it's just a case of, you know what, this is going to sell tickets and we'll be able to pay our artists a higher fee because
Mm.
and therefore we'll be able to kind of compensate them for the labor that they put in. And we as artists are also very aware of like which event we're going to. Like sometimes we know that the the expression that I'm bringing on stage won't hit all the audience members equally, but I'm getting
Yeah.
paid at the end of the day. My labor is being respected,
Mm.
and that's okay as well. Like it doesn't, as you said, Tamar, it doesn't always have to be on us.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
really like that. You know, like I think the line I always draw is my labor and is my work being appropriately compensated, whether that's monetarily or somewhere else. And as long as that baseline's being hit, that then opens up the space, I think, a lot more ethically, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's
And it's
about
like
like
if you
what you
feel
yeah.
no, go ahead.
No, I was saying like it's about what he said earlier that you existing shouldn't always be a political statement. You know, like everyone shouldn't like you're not expected to just I don't know, like deliver a message all the time. It's like it's also as you as an artist and like you deserve the same normalcy, for example, another like
Yeah.
person would.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about like, does it feel good at the end of the day to have done the art in the first place? And I think that like
Mhm.
the compensation or the reward can just be it felt good to get on stage and
Yeah.
like be in this outfit that I created myself and be barefoot and like connect to my culture in this way, or like be listening to this music I created or this writing that I created and feel like I really poured myself into this thing.
Yeah.
I don't actually care if anybody else gets it. And so
Agreed.
the way that we're rewarded, not necessarily like tangibly, but just kind of like that soul reward is also important.
Yeah, I agree. Building on that, we talk a lot about liberatory ways of being and moving in our work, but how do we reach or like reconnect with Black, brown, or queer bodies who may feel disconnected from these ways of being, especially when we have been taught over time to strive for something else, something more acceptable, more legible, more normal. So how do we begin to deprioritize that pull towards normalcy and instead teach our bodies collectively that it's okay to move differently? And in that context, how would you define erotic agency in a way that resists both commodification and respectability politics? If
Hmm. this might not fully answer that, but I
Yeah,
actually think,
you're.
but I think part of it's also, especially when you're thinking about connecting with queer and black and brown bodies who maybe
Mhm.
don't feel the same level of comfort in approaching some of these spaces. What I've always found quite liberating, and certainly I found this liberating in the early stages of my own journey to accepting my queerness, because that was its own roller coaster. But I guess it's kind of reminding ourselves that, the point I said about there's no one way of being, right?
Yeah.
And for some folks, actually their comfort in queerness can be something that's quite conventional. It can be something that's actually quite almost not quite heteropatriarchal, because that's problematic, but a little, like, comparatively speaking, heteronormative.
Yeah.
I guess it's more about reassuring folks that the idea of exploring and the idea of playing is in and of itself not a bad thing. And as long as you feel safe to do that exploration, it doesn't matter where you end up at the end of that. It could be something where you end up at a completely different spot to where you started on your journey. It could be that you've, like, only moved an inch. But I think where that struggle comes in is what society keeps teaching us is not just that other ways of being are wrong, but even exploring other ways of being is wrong and immoral in many cases. So I think for me
Yeah.
it's more about the play than it is about the result.
Yeah.
Certainly, like, as a, I use a lot of Madison Moore's work. So again, for folks who haven't explored any of his work, he is an incredible black queer DJ and critic, and particularly he's written a book called Fabulous, which is about, the idea of beauty and, like, DIY sustainable grassroots beauty as something quite glamorous, is kind of like this antidote to this very polished beauty that requires all this maintenance and often the exploitation of labor. So it's kind of more this idea of how marginalized bodies can create beauty and how radical and empowering that is. It always kind of comes back to, you don't have to be prescriptive with what that means, but it's more about giving yourself that permission to play and explore.
Yeah.
So
I
that's
think it's
always what
also
I think
like,
about.
yeah, it's also like having the option to
Yeah.
experiment, because oftentimes you're not given that many options and you're publicly scrutinized for what you choose. So like, I think having the options is what matters the most. And everyone is obviously not going to have the same experience. Yeah. And what were you saying, Tamar?
I think that idea of play is something that's really kind of sticking in my brain and feels important. I was having a conversation with one of my friends, maybe like last week, and we were talking about children and how when children are like new to the world, like a baby's new to the world, everything that they do is play. And everything that play is rewarded. Like, they're rewarded for going out and touching the grass. They're rewarded for having an apple for the first time. They're rewarded for, like, picking out an outfit for the first, like, all of these first things that are ultimately for them just exploration in the world is rewarded by someone clapping for them and, like, saying good job. And then when you get older, like, when I put my outfit on this morning, no one was like, good job, Tamar, for putting on your outfit. It just kind of is what it was. And I think that, like, and so that's happening on top of the fact that the stuff that we are getting rewarded for are these kind of more like conventional ways of being.
Yeah.
And we're taught to strive for those rewards because somebody's going to clap for you if you get a house and you've paid this amount of money for it, or you get married and you have a baby. Like, these are the rewards that people are going to show up for you for. And so I think that part of that exploration and part of having those options is finding other ways of, like, how do I reward myself, or how do we reward ourselves so that these still feel like they're important to strive for. And we have the option to say, I could go get rewarded for this thing, but I also could get rewarded for this too. I might not get money for it, or I might not get whatever for it, but it'll still feel good to have done anyway.
Yeah. It's interesting that both of you guys talked about rewards, because I was thinking, when you don't follow the conventional way, you get dismissed or mocked, which is very common for marginalized bodies, Black, brown, queer people. And I wanted to bring up what you wrote, Tamar, because you noted that Black women's expressions of pleasure are often met with humor or dismissal. And I was really thinking about it because in a moment when states and institutions are increasingly invested in controlling bodies and policing sexual expression, how do you think how politically urgent it is for this Black women's, for example, Black women's pleasure to be treated as politically urgent? And I also wanted to say it obviously doesn't only limit to Black women particularly, but I wanted to bring it up because that's what you mentioned. So you can also give your take Ibtisam on maybe from your perspective. And I also wanted to talk about, especially in contemporary meme culture on the internet, where marginalized people are always the butt of the joke, and their pleasure or even them just reclaiming their identity are always met with dismissal or mocked. How is it even possible to reclaim it without getting rewarded, as you said before, or being taken seriously in any form?
That's a really big question. I think that the first part of your question of how urgent is it to take Black women's sexuality, in my case, seriously, I think it's always urgent. I don't think that this particular political moment has made it more urgent. I think it just has been. Even if it hasn't been talked about out loud, I think that Black women have always felt that. I think that queer folks, anybody that's marginalized, has always felt the urgency of what it feels like to be in any where there's always a moment happening with all of us all the time. It just kind of depends on.
It's also how their health is also not taken as seriously. Isn't there a record of it where if they complain about it, they're kind of seen as hysterical, or the people think they're lying, doctors don't take them seriously or their pain. I think it all goes hand in hand.
There's plenty of Black women who are pregnant and they're in labor and they're not given epidural or something to manage the pain because the doctors are just your pain tolerance, you're not actually experiencing any pain. So even just the idea of a marginalized body, a Black woman's body experiencing something like that, being taken seriously, that just has always been a concern. And so I think that part of the question, just the urgency is always there. I think as far as the internet is a interesting place. And I think that's the first word that came to mind when you brought up the second part of your question is risk. And what is the risk for putting queered bodies, Black women's bodies, brown bodies on the internet, and what then what then what's the thing that happens? I think that the internet can be a space for having these types of conversations and putting these types of representations. I mean, all of our work is on an online magazine right now. And so the internet can be a space for that stuff. At the same time, once those images are online, we don't have control over where they go after that. And so the risk of what happens once the image is out of your control is always there. And so I think at that point, it's about weighing the risk. And is it more important for me to put my image out there in this kind of counter or subversive way and hope that it gets to the person that I want it to get to, and we can be able to connect with each other in that way, or get to the people that it should get to, while still maybe being available for somebody else? Or do I keep it to myself and find some other way of distributing this kind of counterness, this subversiveness, instead of using online space? So I don't have a clean answer, but I think it's complicated.
What about you, Ibtisam?
I think something that's really important for me to acknowledge, and I'm going to acknowledge this in steps, because it's again different aspects of my existence and my different parts of my art that come into play. As a performer based in the global north, the queer scene owes so much to Black women, Black trans women in particular. But the whole you go into the lexicon of what's considered queer language now, and all of it stems from Black language. And I think one of the things that we are getting better at, but we need to keep working on it, is not only acknowledging those roots, but knowing where we need to take a step back. To use the House of Spice as an example, we are very, very, very intentional in never calling ourselves a ballroom house. One, because that's not how we perform, but two, because ballroom has a very, very specific queer history. So even though we take part in events that have comparisons or are almost ballroom adjacent, because the idea of the catwalk and the idea of these fashion categories stem from the ballroom, we're very intentional in not saying that that's what we're doing, because that carries a very specific history, that carries a very specific weight, and it isn't ours to appropriate that. And I think so from that kind of global north perspective, there's so much of popular culture, there's so much of queer culture that is based on the foundations of Black women's labor, without Black women often being credited for it. I think for starters, we need to be really on it and intentional and ethical about that. But also, as someone from the global South, I think sometimes we forget, as a South Asian, our own kind of complicated navigations with Blackness, and particularly with anti-Blackness. I think, for instance, as a Bangladeshi, not many people seem to be aware that we have had history with Black communities before European colonization. We used to have extremely strong trade, religious, and cultural links with Africa. We used to even have a Black Bangladeshi, well, sorry, Bangladeshi is the wrong word for this because that was way before, but a Black Bengali dynasty. And we don't talk about these things because issues of colorism, issues of anti-Blackness are very strong in parts of South Asia. So I think when we talk about things like Black women's agency in a South Asian context, it might not be the kind of same kind of popular culture capital because the context is very different. But we need to be very mindful of where our privileges lie in kind of relative context and relative comparison. And for me, it always also comes back to solidarity. Like, where can I, as someone who isn't Black, offer my solidarity to Black people, whereas someone is a man, where can I offer that solidarity to women and femmes and non-binary folks? Because that often goes both ways. I think people forget that as well. So for me, it's very much like, as the outsider to that question, I think it's really just about recognizing where some of those histories are, learning about that, and providing that solidarity in place.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting. I think it's interesting to hear both of your perspectives, because obviously everyone will not have the same answer. So, and it's a difficult time to navigate these feelings. I was very interested in like I know, like you said, the internet is very complicated, but I feel like right now it's like the main political platform of the world almost. Like, even if someone is political, it doesn't mean that they're always going out in the streets and protesting or like making their thoughts be known. For me, from my perspective, as a 23-year-old woman living here and going to uni, I feel like I find out people are political based on the content they like and share online, and that's how I know, oh, this is what they believe in, and this is what they think of. This is what they think of marginalized people. This is what their political beliefs are. So I think in a world like that, like especially the meme culture, which is what people think is making, it's basically jokes. But recently I felt like it's more than just jokes, when it's always just like you're making fun of the same people, you're dismissing the same people, you're mocking the same people. And even like over the past 3 years, I feel like everyone has, or like the tone has gotten very conservative drastically. And so in an atmosphere like this, in an environment like this, how do marginalized people like reclaim body, their sexual agency when, I don't want to sound hopeless, obviously, but when it seems like regardless of whatever you do, you will always be dismissed. And it's not like it's just like the dismissal is inevitable or anything. Like, do we have hope? Actually, that would be a better question. Is there hope? Yeah.
Oh, my answer that I have right now, and then I'll hear what Ibtisam has to say, and then I might change my answer later.
Yeah, so-
But I can't remember exactly what you said, but you mentioned something about inevitability
yeah.
and whether or not, like, my paraphrasing of what you said is like whether or not people doing that type of dismissal is inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think that it just is. I think that
No,
is something.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't
You
mean
might
the
be clear.
Yeah, I don't mean the dismissal. I meant like, yeah, I guess I meant the dismissal, but like,
Okay.
it's also like if you are like trying to reclaim your identity, I'm just thinking, is it even possible to reclaim it in this atmosphere? Like, I guess,
Yeah.
that is the dismissal inevitable. Like, but I'm thinking from like your perspective, like not about what people do. It's like, will you ever be
Sure.
taken seriously technically? Or is this like a hopeless attempt over and over? Which sounds so hopeless, but I don't mean it like that.
No. I think you're being realistic. And I think
Yeah.
that like part of my answer was going to be that like that dismissal was inevitable regardless of whether the internet
Yeah.
existed. So if the
Mhm.
internet wasn't here, like people were doing this before the internet.
Yeah.
And
The internet is more of an echo chamber, I guess. It's
Right.
given more of like a voice to like
right.
the ignorant people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so because people have a history of doing this type of like self-determination, like agential work before the internet, while people were still being dismissive, we have strategies for doing that kind of work anyway. And so
Yeah.
I think what ends up being the question is less like, should we have hope? Which I think that we should. I think we should have
Yeah.
hope within like realism. But I think that like it ends up kind of being on an individual and collective level of how worth it is it for you to continue to be hopeful while recognizing that dismissal is inevitable. So if someone's
Yeah.
always going to
Yeah.
be like, I don't really care about what you're saying, I'm committed to misunderstanding you.
Yeah.
Is it worth it for us to be hopeful anyway and say like, okay, if you're going to take this image, I'm still going to do what I want to do. I'm still going to create what I
Yeah.
want to create anyway, because that's a part of my humanity. That's how I express myself, express my agency. And I think that like, I have a specific answer to that, and I think my answer is
Yeah.
yes, that people should do
Yeah.
that. But I also think that that question is very individual, and there might be some folks who are just
Mhm.
like, I don't actually like my hopelessness is it, and I just need to sit in
Yeah.
this right now, and I don't want to contribute anything more because it's going to be taken away
I
or
don't think like
misunderstood.
I don't think like it's like you should be hopeless, but sometimes when I think from a more realistic point of view and I think, but are we getting somewhere though? But I guess that's a hopeless way to look at it. Yeah. Like what were you gonna say, Ibtisam?
I mean, I guess it's also that reminder that things like hope and joy are also strategies. Like they're not just
Yeah.
passive words that don't mean anything. I think it's, understanding that being intentional about loving your own work and respecting you're respecting your own worth. It's not just saying something. It is an actual practical, semi-tangible thing. It's an action, right? And I guess when you bring in something like the internet to that, something that has done wonders for my mental health is not necessarily trying to think of the internet as this unbelievable space of nothing but positive potential, but it's also about understanding what the internet is, what it isn't. Like even just comparing myself a decade ago to now, like how I respond to people leaving negative comments. I mean, 9 times out of 10 they're bots anyway. But also just like giving yourself that permission to go, you know what, this isn't worth my time. Or sometimes in some rare occasions actually be like, you know what, this comment actually is worth engaging with because there's something there. And I think from a community perspective, something I've really learned to respect through working with a lot of queer performers, but also working with like a lot of queer community organizers, is recognizing the internet an aspect of your toolkit rather than like your whole toolkit. So I've seen so many people who use the internet really smartly about things like organizing spaces and finding common ground, and particularly in a post-COVID age, if folks aren't able to travel or if they're separated by distance, like kind of using the internet as a way to bring people together, but then also not putting all their value and worth into it. Like and Tamar, I know that our pieces, I completely agree with you about like our pieces being out there, but my piece, certainly in my case, like my pieces aren't created on the internet, they're kind of curated on there. I guess they're presented there. And I think even for folks whose primary means of artistic expression is an online expression, it's just thinking strategically around that and reminding ourselves of like, yes, the internet's a really powerful tool and it can be used in really positive ways, but also like recognizing how much of ourselves we should put into it. But also, like, you know, I guess the other nice thing about it is we are actually seeing some positive pushbacks as well. Like I don't know the exact story, so I'm not trying to quote it, but I know that there's been some genuinely important conversations around OpenAI recently in terms of platforms no longer using it or no longer renewing some of their contracts with certain aspects of like OpenAI. I believe a platform called Sora, which used to use a lot of generative AI, is not going to continue. So I think, you know, when we are constantly being bombarded, and also let's not forget the people who share all these messages are the ones who have a vested interest in keeping their power in place, right? But actually the reality is more and more people are being critical of the internet, more and more people are being critical of these things. So it does give me hope, and it's okay to push on that, I guess.
You know, on that note, on like hope and joy and whatever, I wanted to also ask, because in your article you distinguished between transgression as exhaustive and transformative transgression as joyful and intentional. What conditions are necessary for transgression to shift from survival to celebration? I know you like basically talked about it, but I also had that written down, so I wanted to ask.
I mean, for me, it kind of goes back to what I initially said, which is very much about that agency and kind of what I'm engaging with. And a really fantastic example of this is someone, so this isn't my example and it's not even from the performance space, but a really wonderful trans friend of mine who works in the LGBTQ charity sector in the UK. Her job as a community advocate is to go and talk about trans sensitivity in public spaces. And she always makes the distinction between going into these spaces, which is part of her job, and often handling deeply uncomfortable and sometimes even invasive questions, versus being questioned on the street by someone who's gone, "Oh, you're trans, let me talk to you about this." And she's effectively doing the same thing in both spaces, but in one case it's her taking the agency to go into a space and open herself up to those questions, versus someone coming in and just assuming that her labor is there for free. And I think as performers, as marginalized bodies, it for me it's always going to come back to that question of agency. Am I willfully taking part in an act of transgression that is centering myself, or is an act of transgression being imposed onto me, usually by a system that doesn't even understand who I am? So that's kind of where I sit with it personally.
So before we like kind of start wrapping it up, I have another question. What does solidarity look like when experiences of marginalization are uneven, even within the same community? I think both of you will have different takes on this and different perspective, but it applies to like basically Black, brown, queer people everywhere, because there are a lot of divisions among these communities.
I think the first thing that's coming to my mind now is around understanding. I think that a lot of the division that we have is based on like misrepresentations. Like we're all just kind of running off of incomplete knowledge because the way that we're interacting with communities that aren't our own is often either through the internet or through some
Mm-hmm.
other kind of source that's incomplete. Like we're not actually
Mm-hmm.
talking to folks who aren't like us typically. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
just kind of getting out into the world and having different types of conversations that aren't reductive, and we're not just like my thing is the same thing as your thing, because that's also not useful to like
Yeah,
essentialize differences. But I think
the
just like having a
understanding.
having a conversation and
Mm-hmm.
saying, this is what I have, this is what you have, what are the bones of that thing that could be
Yeah,
similar, but how it does it end up being different as well.
yeah,
And I guess coming into that conversation with a little bit of recognition of where you sit in it individually versus structurally. So like
Right.
if
Mm-hmm.
I'm having conversations, I've had conversations with community members, academics, activists about like, Black womanhood, for instance, is just one example that we touched on earlier. I hope, through my actions, not be racist or misogynist, but I'm also, as a non-Black man, going to benefit from those systems. And
Yeah,
it's important for me to recognize that that's not a personal failure, but it is still important for me to recognize where I sit within that structure. So I think going into these conversations, and by the way, that's just touching on two things. There's added
mm-hmm.
elements of
Yeah,
nationality, class, which often gets
mm-hmm.
overlooked. But it's really that understanding that a lot of these conversations are very rarely about individual action, and it's much more
Yeah,
about structural change. So, don't take criticisms of structures as an individual attack. Learn where you sit in that, what you can benefit from by just sitting with that. And actually that can make your actions of solidarity a lot more powerful, because then you're leveraging your privilege rather than getting angry about it.
mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think intersectionality is very important, and like once people learn to accept it and also acknowledge every part of their identities, it will definitely help create better solidarity. We do have a question, but before that, do you guys want to ask each other any question? Do you have any questions for each other?
I guess this is a really basic one, Tamar, but I think reading your piece and that question of kind of sonic connectivity and the kind of intimacy of music, this is going to be really basic, but is there a particular type or genre of music that you as an individual and as like a researcher feel more connectivity to? Because I also find that obviously that's quite a subjective and personal thing, and I'm just curious, like where does that draw you in? Because as an artist, I always love to know influences.
Yeah. Thank you for calling me a researcher. That was really nice. I think that I don't feel like I have an allegiance towards any, which you're not asking. I don't think I have an allegiance towards any specific genre. I think that the one that I feel like I find, my actual answer is that I feel like I find home in a bunch of different types. I think that I find home in Black music in particular, just kind of as the umbrella. But underneath that, I think different parts of myself, I find home within that thing, depending on what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And so that kind of is a little bit of a cop out answer, but I think that it just, depending on what I'm looking for personally, I might go towards R&B, I might go towards hip hop, but I might also go towards like some obscure rock album that nobody's heard of in like 20, 30 years. And so like depending on how I need to be fed at the time, that's what I typically move towards.
I kind of love that about like finding home in different spaces. I think that's quite enriching. So no, thank you for that. I love that.
Yeah, I do have a question for you. I thought that the photos of the outfits that you created in I don't know, did you refer to them as costumes or outfits?
I refer to them as costumes within that piece, but yes.
Okay. So I am really curious about the process of you making your costumes, because like I can't sew. I have a sewing machine, don't know anything about it at all, but I'm so interested just in kind of like, you mentioned a little bit before around like being intentional of choosing fabrics that like have like Bangladeshi heritage kind of built into them. And so I'm curious about like your process of picking fabrics and what does it feel like to be putting something together by hand in that way, and like who are you making toward when you're putting a costume together?
So I should actually say that not all of my looks are sewn by me. Very, very few
Okay.
pieces are actually fully sewn by me. So I think like it's also important for me to state that. In fact, one of the photos, if folks happen to look at the article I've written, which includes pictures of some of my costumes, one of them is a full white look, and that was actually made entirely out of individual pieces that I found in like charity shops and pieces that I happen to have with me from back in Bangladesh anyway. So I think and especially as like a grassroots performer who doesn't have loads of budget and loads of money to be making stuff, like I actually really advocate for people just going to, so in the UK it would be charity shops like thrift stores or like local clothing shops rather than branded ones, or just finding stuff and again just playing with it a little bit. But in terms of pieces that I am now beginning to sew, including there's a piece which is a cape that I've made of different blue fabrics. That one was just going into a fabric shop and actually trying, like literally it started with me first looking for the pattern that I wanted, but then actually physically touching it. Like I don't like fabric shopping online. I know it can be really useful for loads of people, especially if you're on a budget or on like an accessibility need, but I like touching the fabrics, actually seeing how it feels. And also, like for me personally, the people I've learned to sew from are all either queer or Bangladeshi or both. So for me, it's also been intentional about, okay, if I'm learning the skill, am I learning it from someone who is a member of the community? And therefore, if I'm paying for that service, is it going back to someone who has that same kind of lived experience? The first person who taught me to sew is a wonderful queer British Bangladeshi by the name of Jahida Chaudhry, who works as a costumier in the UK. So it's just kind of very much being intentional about that. And in terms of like the actual process behind the costume, sometimes it depends on if I'm aiming for a specific category, because sometimes there'll be a theme for the event, but a couple of times there isn't. So if there is a theme, it's kind of using that as the launching point. And usually if there isn't a theme, I'm a massive fan of superhero comics. So I kind of like to imagine myself as, how would I dress myself if I was a superhero with an unlimited budget, and go from there.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. It's very interesting to hear like the process behind creating the pieces. Yeah.
Hello. I feel like I just appeared, but this is such an incredibly rich conversation. So many different things to reflect on more. I'm popping in because I wanted to share a couple of the questions that came up as you were talking. So I'm going to share one of them, which I think ties in really nicely to some of the things you talked about, especially earlier. Do any of you value absurdity in art? Is the pursuit of absurdity the domain of those who are most privileged?
I think I do. I think it's important to if you're like, because the whole point is to challenge what's conventional and everything traditional. So I think absurdity is important if you want to evoke that more. Like I personally like it, and I think it gets the point across strongly. Yeah.
But certainly comes up in the film that you analyzed, right? Absurdity as sort of an effective mode for challenging critiquing society.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite films of recent years is Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that's obviously such a fascinating look at kind of nihilism versus absurdity. But for me, what's particularly powerful about that is the absurdity comes from someone saying, let's be nice to each other in a world that's cruel. Like compassion can feel like absurdism in a world that teaches us to be very individualistic and selfish. So I think like absurdity as a philosophy, and to be honest, any philosophy can be misappropriated if it's someone doing it with like loads of privilege and like bad faith actors. But in terms of like actually how you think about, well, what is absurdism and what do you actually mean by that and what you're using it for, like that's the one I always keep coming back to is, yeah, okay, showing compassion and love might be absurdist, but what's better than that in this day and age?
Oh, I did not think about compassion as being absurd, but your point is well taken, right? What it is, it's also very contextualized. Like what is absurd in one context
Yeah.
versus another.
I'm
Interesting.
thinking about the ways that absurdism kind of breaks us open and like it gets us out of what we think we should be looking at, and it can make you uncomfortable. Sometimes being nice to each other could make someone uncomfortable if they're in a world that it's like you're not, like that's not the norm when it should be. But that idea of like I'm seeing something, I'm hearing something that I'm not supposed to or I'm not used to hearing, so what does that mean about me and what can I do with that space of discomfort?
So it really becomes another tool then for challenging norms and challenging status quo, right? Rather than necessarily being just something that is a tool for people who are privileged.
Right.
So maybe just, because the question sort of asks that too, right? Is it just something that's accessible to people who are privileged? But sounds like you're saying, no, not at all. And, it can be a way to sort of challenge status quo from multiple perspectives.
Yeah. I think it could be made, like if it's used by someone of a higher status or it's higher class, then that feels like it's being used to kind of kick some folks out. And then it's a question of not bringing people in, but it's a matter of like, who can we disorient so much to where they don't want to be involved or they can't see what's happening in this thing.
I guess context matters in this case,
Yeah.
where you're applying it.
Yeah, for sure. The other question looks again at sort of the issue of hope. I know that the conversation you've had sort of touches on that many different times. So the question is, do you feel there's a pressure to present art as hopeful, thus suppressing art that is where the primary drive may actually be catharsis? Right. So where's the pressure, or is there pressure to be hopeful? Are there other ways, other emotional processes that are valuable, like catharsis, which may have nothing to do with hope?
A lot of people want it to be hopeful, but I don't think it's mandatory. I don't think it's mandatory for it to be anything. If you want it to just exist because you wanted to make it, that's fine as well. Like it shouldn't sometimes it's for yourself. And I know we talked about viewers and audiences before, and it's kind of like it always doesn't have to be for this imaginary audience or a viewer. It can also exist just because you want it to exist.
Yeah. And I guess just so you know, it's very, speaking from a very practical perspective as someone whose livelihood partially depends on performance, sometimes it's also about recognizing that something that I want to be quiet, I may want something to be a lot more radical than I'm allowed to present it as. But that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to have that thought, or maybe I can present it somewhere else, or maybe, as you said, it doesn't have to be publicly consumable all the time. I personally am someone who's very interested in the politics of hope, so I kind of naturally gravitate towards that, but that just by no means has to apply to everyone. And if it's something that is affecting your livelihood as someone who is creative as a livelihood, it's kind of also recognizing where you're putting your energies in, and recognizing that sometimes you might have to professionally do certain things that might not fit every single aspect of your ethos, but that also doesn't define your totality as an artist. That's just one part of your portfolio, I guess.
I think that tending to hopelessness is important. I think that if that just is the way where someone is, then that just is where they are, and it comes through in their art if it comes through. I think what feels like it's important to me, the kind of question under the question is, where is the hopelessness coming from? And if it feels like it's a manufactured hopelessness that's kind of being ingested from somewhere outside, or if it feels like it's a little bit more internal and it feels like a more intimate hopelessness, then that's a little bit different to me. Because there's one of those you can do something about. I guess you can do something about both of them, but they have a different the steps towards doing something about it. If you do something about it at all, I guess you could just have hopelessness and you don't have to fix it. But depending on where it's coming from, it has a different, you do something about it differently.
Yeah. I was also saying that sometimes, like, for example, if someone makes very hopeless art, it can also be kind of like a reminder to like raise awareness. Like, you don't have to kind of sugarcoat everything just to send like a hopeful message at the end. Like, I have watched films which are kind of, which should be brutal and very realistic, but at the same time it's realistic for a reason. Then you are forced to think about the problem, which is like, I guess even if it's not hopeful, but you can, it's still helping the cause to some extent. So sometimes it can be like that as well.
Yeah. I also think there's some folks that, like, there's some bodies that maybe are seen to be just naturally hopeless. And so what does it mean to look at art? And that might be someone expressing hope, but someone else sees hopelessness because they're just kind of committed to seeing it as hopelessness and they're not seeing hope in it.
Yeah, I guess it's also like about the perception, which should be important.
Yeah.
So what feels hopeless to one person might be helpful to another.
Right.
Yeah. No. Oh, great. Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it up. We've reached a little bit past the hour. And I know we're all in different time zones, so for some of us that matters a lot because it's it's quite late. The rest of us are probably starting our days. But really excited about this conversation. Super rich with different ideas and perspectives, and appreciate all of you taking time to join and share both the articles that you sent to us and we published, but also just taking this time to engage with each other's works and ideas. And I think it really brought us to another level of understanding about art and about intimacy and performance and all these things that are really, I think, important for creating space, right? Creating space for ourselves. And I think one of the things that, at least I've got many takeaways, and I'm going to keep processing some of those, but one of the takeaways that I have is just that need to sort of create and celebrate and protect spaces that are on our own terms, right? That it's not just, we can't always be forced to do things for the validation of others, and certainly all of your work emphasizes that, and I think that that's a really important lesson that all of us should be thinking about. So thank you very much, and thank you for all of those who are listening. We will be putting the recording of this on YouTube and sharing it further. But thank you for everyone here, and please be sure to go and read the articles that were in this issue. Thank you all.
Thanks for joining.